One king said he ruled all of Britain. 5 armies came to prove him wrong. On a blood-soaked battlefield whose name would echo through history, the future of England hung by a thread. Autumn fog rolled over the northern hills like a thick blanket. The year was 937. Across a stretch of land whose exact location has been lost to time, though people called it Brunanburh, 2 massive armies were waking up in the cold gray light before dawn. On one side stood the English, marching under banners of the Golden Dragon of Wessex. 20,000 men, maybe more, drawn from every corner of a country that had never truly been united. Their king was not yet old, barely 40 years of age, but his name alone was enough to make foreign rulers nervous. Athelstan, King of the English, Lord of Britain, grandson of Alfred the Great. Across the open field, very different banners flew in the wind. The Norse raven, the Scottish lion, the old symbols of Strathclyde. Standing opposite the English was not one army, but a powerful alliance. Vikings from Dublin, Scots from Alba, and Britons from the ancient kingdoms of the north. These peoples had come together for a single purpose: to destroy English power before it swallowed them all. They had the numbers to match Athelstan's force, perhaps even more, and they had far more anger. Between these 2 armies, the morning waited. Nobody knew it yet, but what was about to happen over the next 12 hours would answer a question that had haunted Britain for generations. Would England hold together as one nation, or break apart into the same warring pieces from which it had only recently been built? This was not a border skirmish or a quarrel between nobles. This was 2 completely different ideas about what Britain should be, finally forced to fight it out. The war drums started beating. Sunlight broke through the mist, and the day that would give birth to a nation began. To understand why 5 armies showed up on that autumn morning, you first need to understand what Athelstan had done and why it had made him so many powerful enemies. For hundreds of years, the island the Romans called Britannia had been a broken puzzle of rival kingdoms, each one constantly at war with the others. Anglo-Saxon peoples controlled the south and east. Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria all kept their own identity and their own grudges. Viking settlers ran the Danelaw and held Dublin with an iron fist. The Scots had built their kingdom across the north. The Britons held on in Wales and Strathclyde. The Picts kept to their own strongholds. No single king ruled more than a slice of all this. The idea of one unified England was, at best, a wild dream, and at worst, the kind of thinking that got people killed. Then Athelstan arrived. Born sometime in the 890s, he was the son of Edward the Elder and the grandson of Alfred the Great, the famous king who had saved Wessex from total collapse and turned it into the most powerful Saxon kingdom. But Alfred and Edward had been careful men, happy to rule what they had and protect what they held. Athelstan wanted something far bigger. He wanted what no ruler had pulled off in 400 years. He wanted all of England under one crown, his crown. Through sheer determination and military force, he got it. From the moment he took his throne in 924, Athelstan moved against his enemies fast and without mercy. He absorbed Mercia into his kingdom. He conquered Northumbria, the last Viking-held kingdom on English soil. He pushed the Norse kings back across the sea to Ireland. He forced the Welsh princes to submit, made them pay regular tribute, and fixed the border at the River Wye. By 927, he was calling himself King of the English, and he meant every word of it. For the first time since the Romans had left the island, one man's authority reached all the way from the English Channel to the Scottish border. But every ruler who climbs that high and that fast makes enemies in equal measure, and Athelstan had made plenty. Constantine II, King of Scotland, had been watching English expansion with growing unease for years. He was an old man now, toughened by decades of war, and he understood something that younger rulers sometimes missed. Threats that are ignored today have a way of sitting on your doorstep tomorrow. Athelstan had already publicly humiliated him at Amont Bridge, where Constantine had been forced to acknowledge English authority over him. He had bent the knee, he had taken the oath, but back
in his own court, the Scottish kings simmered with barely contained fury. The English were reaching too far. Their king wanted too much. If Athelstan was allowed to fully settle his conquests, Scotland would be next, not as a rival to bargain with, but as just another territory to absorb. Across the Irish Sea, a younger king had his own bitter reasons for wanting Athelstan dead. Olaf Guthruthson, who ruled Dublin and could claim descent from the great Viking warlord Ivar the Boneless, had watched Athelstan systematically dismantle every Viking presence in Britain. York had fallen. The Danelaw had given up. The Norse settlements that had defined northern England for 2 generations were gone, crushed or scattered. For Olaf, this was not just a political problem, it was a matter of survival. A strong, unified England left no room for Norse ambitions on the island. The age of Viking kings in Britain would simply end, ground down under English law and English rule. And in Strathclyde, King Owen of the Britons could see the same pattern playing out around him. The English had taken Northumbria. They controlled Wales. Strathclyde was now surrounded on all sides, a Celtic island in an English sea. If Athelstan decided to finish what he had started, there was nowhere left to go. 3 kings, 3 peoples, 3 very personal reasons to hate the same man. In 937, they made their pact. Constantine would bring his Scottish fighters south, battle-hardened veterans who had spent their whole lives fighting the Norse and knew exactly how to hold a shield wall together. Olaf would bring his Dublin Vikings across the water, younger, fiercer men desperate to take back what their fathers had lost. Owen would add his Britons to the mix. Together, their numbers would outmatch whatever Athelstan could put in the field against them. Together, they would drive deep into England from the north, burning and plundering as they went, and force the English king into a big, open battle where their advantage in numbers would decide everything. Then they would split his kingdom up between themselves. Nothing like this coalition had ever been aimed at England before. If it worked, Athelstan's unified kingdom would die with him. If it failed, nobody would be left to slow England's rise. Athelstan got word of the invasion during the summer of 937. The coalition had gathered near the Scottish border and was preparing to march south. Their plan was easy to read: push deep into the English heartland before proper defense could be organized, burn everything in their path, and then corner the English king in a battle where sheer numbers would win the day. Athelstan did not waste a moment. He sent out the call to arms. From Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and newly conquered Northumbria, the warriors came. Noblemen with their retinues, professional soldiers, and ordinary farmers and craftsmen who picked up their weapons when the king commanded. Many of these men had been fighting each other within living memory, carrying old grievances from wars their fathers had started. But now they served one king, marching under one banner. Athelstan had spent 13 years building England into something real. He was not going to watch foreign armies tear it apart without making them bleed for every inch. He rode north with his younger brother Edmund at his side. Edmund was barely 20 years old, but he had already proven himself in battle, and he would inherit the kingdom if things went badly. They moved fast, picking up more soldiers as they went, with one goal in mind: reach the coalition before it could do serious damage to the English interior. Somewhere in the north, the two sides finally met. Historians have argued for 1,000 years about exactly where. Various places have been suggested: Brunanburh on the Wirral, the Humber estuary, the open moorland of Northumbria, but the name that survived through the centuries was Brunanburh. Whether it was a field, a valley, or a river crossing no longer really matters. What happened there does. By the last weeks of summer or the first weeks of autumn in 937, both armies had taken their positions. The coalition stood ready, confident in their numbers and certain their cause was just. Athelstan stood ready too, fully aware that everything he had built could be wiped out before the next sunrise. Neither side had any interest in talking their way out of this. Both had come for a final answer, and the side that lost would have no voice in how history told the story. The coalition set up camp first. Constantine, Olaf, and Owen looked over the terrain and chose their ground carefully. They needed space, enough
a locked-in stillness that said something to anyone experienced enough to read it. Between the two armies lay a few hundred yards of open, undisturbed ground. Grass, rocks, patches of soft earth, ground that would soon be completely transformed. Athelstan took his place at the center of the English line, fully visible in his royal armor. He wanted the enemy to see him standing there. He wanted them to know that the king of the English was not going to issue commands from a safe distance while other men died for him. Across the open ground, Constantine and Olaf saw him and understood exactly what that meant. They would be doing the same thing. This battle was not going to be decided by generals who kept themselves carefully out of harm's way. The men leading both sides would be right in the middle of it. The sun kept climbing. The wind died completely. 40,000 men stood facing each other in total silence, each side watching the other, waiting for the sound that would release everything. Then the horns called out, the drums answered, and the armies began moving forward. The sound of impact was nothing like thunder. Thunder is clean and brief. This was something far worse. The sound of 20,000 men driving headlong into 20,000 more, shields splitting apart, iron crashing against iron, thousands of individual voices fusing into one enormous wall of noise that wiped out every thought and left nothing behind but pure instinct. The coalition hit first on the right side of their line. Olaf's Vikings did not wait for the measured Scottish advance in the center. They accelerated forward, hungry to get to the killing, and slammed into the English left flank with the force of a falling wall. Shields drove forward, axes went up and came down. The Norse battle cries they screamed cut through even the general roar of the battle and got into the nerves of men who had heard plenty of battle cries in their time. The English line buckled under the impact. For a terrible moment it looked like it might give way. Then the professional soldiers locked their shields back together and shoved hard in return, jabbing spears over the top of the wall, hauling down Viking fighters who pushed too far forward, holding their ground because giving it up meant dying. In the center, the Scots came on with a different kind of danger, slower, more controlled, more deliberate. Constantine's men were veterans. They had stayed alive through decades of hard fighting by being smarter and tougher than whoever was trying to kill them on any given day. They did not rush. They walked forward in coordinated steps, tightening the distance a yard at a time, until their shield wall ground into Athelstan's with a crash that shook the earth beneath both formations. For a moment after the collision, nothing moved. Two solid masses of men and shields simply pressed against each other, each side straining to push the other back. Men in the front row could barely breathe. There was no room to swing freely, no room to step back, no room to do anything except take the crushing weight and keep standing. The men directly behind pushed forward, adding their bodies to the effort, everyone leaning in and grinding forward one brutal inch at a time. The men right at the front died fastest, crushed past the point of survival, stabbed by spears they never had space to dodge, dragged down into the churning mass below where they were trampled. But for every man who dropped, the man behind him stepped into the gap. The line held. On the English right, Edmund's soldiers met Owain's Britons in a clash every bit as brutal as what was happening everywhere else, but with its own particular desperation underneath it. The Britons were fighting with the frantic energy of men who knew in their bones that if England survived this day, their kingdom had no future. They came at Edmund's flank again and again, searching for the weak point that would let them curl around behind the English formation. Edmund, barely out of his teens, carrying more responsibility than most men twice his age ever face, answered each attack by pushing his men forward into the Britons before they could build momentum, then pulling them back into a tight defensive line before the next wave hit. He was all over that flank, bleeding, yelling, refusing to give ground. The battle dissolved into something almost impossible to describe clearly. Individual acts of courage or skill barely registered. What mattered was the collective mass of hundreds of bodies pressing in one direction or the other. Soldiers could not see more than enough
Room for their larger force to spread out and bring its full weight to bear, without being funneled into a narrow corridor where the English could cancel out their numerical advantage. They found what they were looking for. A wide open stretch of land where thousands of men could form a broad front, with gentle slopes that would give both sides a clear view of each other as they advanced. For the Scots and the Strathclyde Britons, this felt like home territory. Cool and damp northern countryside, even in the tail end of summer, smelling of heather and peat. For Olaf's Dublin Vikings, the surroundings were unfamiliar, but that hardly mattered. They had sailed across the Irish Sea looking for revenge, and they were ready to find it wherever the ground took them.
That night, the coalition's commanders sat together to work out their plan for the following day. Constantine, the oldest and the most experienced of the three, argued for patience. Hold their line, let the English come uphill to them. Let the march tire Athelstan's men before the real fighting even started. Olaf, younger and more hot-headed, wanted to attack at first light and use their numbers to smash the English formation before it had time to properly settle. Owen, stuck between the two, kept pushing them back to the only thing he cared about, staying unified. 3 armies pulling in 3 different directions would achieve nothing. 3 armies moving as one might achieve everything. They settled on a straightforward plan. Stretch the line across the full width of the field. Let the English run themselves into the coalition's wall, then use the extra numbers to fold around both English flanks and squeeze the life out of them. It did not need to be clever. It just needed to work. Across the field, Athelstan was dealing with a problem of a different kind. He was outnumbered, but the deeper challenge was unity. The army behind him was stitched together from men whose communities had been at each other's throats within living memory. Wessex men stood next to Mercians, whose grandfathers had raided their villages. Northumbrians stood alongside the very soldiers who had conquered their homeland. Trained professional warriors stood next to farmers who had been handed a spear and pointed south. This was supposed to be the army of a united England, but it had never been put to a test like this one. Athelstan kept his plan simple. No clever flanking moves, no tricky use of the terrain. He would do what English armies had done since Alfred's time, when the Danes pressed hard. Build the shield wall, lock it together, and refuse to let it move. He placed his strongest men, his personal household troops, experienced veterans who had fought at his side across a dozen campaigns, at the very center of the line, right where the enemy commanders would aim their hardest push. Edmund took one flank. Trusted senior commanders held the other. Behind the professionals, the feared men, the ordinary men called up from farms and workshops, waited in packed rows, ready to step into whatever gaps the fighting tore open. The king did not give speeches that night. He walked among his men instead. His presence was enough. These warriors knew what they were defending. They knew what defeat would mean for everyone at home. There was nothing more to say. As night settled over the field, both camps fell into a restless kind of quiet. Fires burned in both directions as far as the eye could see. Men ran whetstones along sword edges, tightened their armor, and said their prayers. To God for most, though on both sides there were men who quietly addressed older powers that proper Christians were not supposed to acknowledge anymore. Those with families waiting at home scratched out what words they could, just in case. Others sat still and stared at the enemy fires across the darkness, doing the arithmetic of survival in their heads. The night dragged on. Wind moved over the moorland with the smell of rain that never actually fell. Sentries walked their rounds and watched for movement, but no attack came in the darkness. Every man on that field understood that this was going to be settled in daylight, with everyone able to see exactly what was happening. No tricks, no ambushes, no mercy. The sky started to lighten. Officers shouted. Men pulled on their mail, strapped on their helmets, picked up their weapons, and moved into formation. The coalition spread itself across the northern end of the field, an enormous crowd of armed men, banners snapping above them in the early morning air. The English formed up opposite, smaller in number, but standing. Within a few feet ahead of them, they identified friend from enemy by the color of a shield or the shape of a helmet, glimpsed for a split second in the chaos. No orders could be heard above the noise. Men fought on training and instinct alone, running through the same basic actions over and over. Block, stab, push, step forward, because stopping to think meant dying. When the man next to you fell, you did not have time to look down. You stepped over him and kept going. The sun passed overhead toward midday. Neither side broke. The dead piled up, first hundreds, then climbing toward thousands, but both formations absorbed the losses and kept their shape. Men who had marched onto the field that morning with fresh legs and clear heads were now running purely on something beyond ordinary human endurance. Too tired to feel fear the way they normally would, too far committed to think about turning back, simply continuing because that was the only thing left to do. Athelstan was not watching this from behind his men. He was in the thick of it, embedded with his household troops at the very center of the English line. His sword had been red from its work for hours. His voice was raw from constantly calling encouragement to the men around him. He cut down Scots who broke through the front of the line. He grabbed soldiers who were beginning to waver and steadied them with his own hands. He stayed visible, and he stayed there, because he knew that as long as his men could see their king still standing and still fighting, they would not fall apart around him. Constantine was doing exactly the same thing on the other side of the field, a man past 60, an age by which most warriors of that era were already dead or long retired, standing in the front row of the worst fighting of the day, swinging his sword with the same steadiness he had shown 40 years earlier. He had given his whole life to keeping Scotland free. He was not going to abandon that at the moment it mattered most. As the afternoon wore on and neither side had collapsed, a strange and terrible kind of balance seemed to have settled over the whole battlefield. Both armies were dealing out and soaking up punishment at a pace no human force can maintain forever, but neither one was showing the signs that mean a formation is about to give way. They stayed locked together, two exhausted, bleeding bodies that could not pull apart and could not finish each other off. And then, slowly, the balance began to tip. The coalition's structure started to weaken the way old wood develops cracks, not in one sudden dramatic moment, but through small failures spreading quietly outward from multiple points until the whole thing becomes unreliable. On the coalition's right, Olaf's Vikings had been hurling themselves at the English left for hours with an intensity that simply could not last. Their charges had been fierce and fearless. They had also failed. Every single time. The English line had refused to break, and the cost of that refusal had been paid in Viking dead, experienced fighters, men of rank, lying face down in the mud. Now the attacks were arriving with noticeably less force. The gaps between them were longer. Men who had closed with the English earlier that day with cold, focused fury were now glancing over their shoulders, the telltale sign of a force that is starting to think about retreat. The Scottish centre was going through its own version of the same thing. Constantine's wall was technically still together, but it had been giving ground all afternoon, not in a single sudden collapse, but steadily, yard by hard-fought yard, against an English centre that seemed to get more efficient with each hour that passed. Athelstan's household troops rotated their men with practiced regularity, making sure the soldiers on the front edge of the wall were always as fresh as they could be, always capable of one more exchange. The Scots had no such system. Their endurance, however impressive, had limits, and Edmund had spotted the weakness developing on the coalition's left, where the Britons were cracking under the weight of his repeated counterattacks. He started throwing his remaining reserves into that spot, piling pressure onto the place where the coalition's foundation was softest. The entire coalition's strategy had been built on one assumption, that the English line would shatter in the first hours of the battle under the weight of their combined assault. That assumption had been wrong. The English had held. Now the armies that had bet everything on that assumption were exhausted, badly hurt, and beginning to face the possibility that they had spent everything they had for nothing. Athelstan saw all of it at once. The Viking hesitation, the Scots losing ground, Edmund pushing the Britons back. He understood, with the sharp clarity that comes to commanders who are also in the fight themselves, that the moment had come, and it would not last long. If he hit now, the coalition might fall apart completely. If he held back and let his men catch their breath, the coalition's officers would find ways to steady their lines, and the numbers advantage would start to matter again tomorrow. He raised his sword and roared the order, "Forward!" The English did not advance, they exploded. The shift from holding the line to full-blown attack happened so fast that the coalition soldiers, who had been pushing against sustained English resistance for hours, had almost no time to adjust. Weak points in the coalition line were found and driven through almost simultaneously across the whole front. English warriors poured into the gaps.
The grinding, controlled struggle of the afternoon became something far more chaotic and dangerous, a broken, scattered, every man for himself fight in which formations had ceased to exist, and the only rule was kill or be killed. Edmund drove his flank into the Viking force from the side at the exact same moment the English center surged forward. The Vikings, already wavering, suddenly found themselves attacked from two directions at once. Their formation did not bend, it simply stopped being a formation. Warriors who had fought with absolute commitment all day found themselves cut off, surrounded, with no way out except to die where they stood or run. Some died, most ran. In the center, the Scottish collapse accelerated from a slow process into a sudden one. Men at the back of Constantine's formation, who had spent hours watching the front rank die while feeling the English pressure steadily grow, decided together, without any formal order being given, that the battle was lost. They turned and went. The men ahead of them had no real choice but to follow. The shield wall that had held through hours of brutal fighting broke apart in minutes. English soldiers pushed through the collapsing Scottish line and began pursuing the men fleeing northward, cutting them down with the grim efficiency of an army that knows the battle is already won. Owen's Britons, already in serious trouble on the coalition's left, looked at the Scottish center caving in and the Vikings dissolving on the right and made the only calculation that made any sense. They ran northward as fast as exhausted legs on broken terrain would carry them, with English cavalry appearing behind them before most had gotten very far. A great many did not escape. Olaf Gutfridsson fought his way clear of the encirclement and fled with the handful of men still around him. He had crossed from Dublin with grand visions of reconquest, of taking back what Athelstan had stripped from his people, of restoring Norse power in northern England. He left with a shattered army, a ruined reputation, and Ireland as his only remaining option. Athelstan called off the pursuit before full darkness fell. His men were at the very edge of what the human body can do. They had what victory requires. The enemy was broken, the field was theirs, the threat was gone. Chasing shadows through the dark over unfamiliar ground risked throwing away everything the day's suffering had bought. As dusk came down over the field of Brunanburh, the English soldiers stood among the wreckage and understood what they had done. The largest military coalition ever directed at England had come specifically to destroy them, and it was now scattered across the moorland. Thousands of Scots and Norse and Britons lying dead together, mingled in death just as they had been in alliance. The invaders had arrived expecting to carve up England between themselves. England had proved harder to carve than they expected. Athelstan moved through the aftermath as the light faded, checking on his men, taking account of which of his lords and commanders had come through, adding up the price that had been paid. It was a steep one. Hundreds of English warriors, possibly thousands, would not be going home. But the line had not broken. Through everything the coalition had sent at it, the wild fury of the Viking assault, the grinding discipline of the Scottish veterans, the desperate intensity of the Britons, the English shield wall had stood its ground. The worst threat the new English kingdom had ever faced was finished. Edmund found his older brother near the center of the field, where the day had been hardest. The young prince was soaked in blood from hours of close fighting, not all of it other men's. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing adequate to say. They had saved something their grandfather had begun building, something that had come within a hair's breadth of dying on this field today. And they had not just saved it, they had proved it could survive. All around them, English warriors moved through the carnage looking for friends and comrades, calling names out into the growing dark, measuring hope against silence. Fires were lit as full night came down, not the working fires of an army preparing for tomorrow, but the quiet fires of men honoring their dead. The English buried their own with whatever dignity the situation allowed. The coalition's dead were left where they had fallen, a clear message to any future king who might be thinking along similar lines.
Before dawn broke the next morning, what remained of the coalition was already far away, retreating as quickly as broken armies can manage, back towards Scotland, towards Strathclyde, toward the ships waiting to carry the Norse survivors home to Dublin, and the painful job of explaining to their people how everything had gone so wrong. They left behind their dead, their weapons, their flags, and every expectation they had arrived with. Athelstan had proved something that day that went beyond winning a battle. He had shown that his England, this new and still fragile thing, built from peoples who had been enemies within living memory, could hold together under the greatest pressure imaginable. The men who had fought in his shield wall had not done so as Mercians or Northumbrians or West Saxons. They had fought as Englishmen. It was the first time that had genuinely been true. When the sun rose over Brunanburh the next morning, it rose over a kingdom that had passed through its hardest test and come out the other side. The coalition would never try anything like this again. The Viking era of conquest in England was over. The Scots would stay behind their own borders and think very carefully before challenging English power again for a long generation to come. The path England would follow from this point forward had been set, paid for in the lives of thousands of men who believed deeply in what they were fighting for. Athelstan gave the order to march south. His army, battered and bone-tired but victorious, formed up and began the long road home. They left behind a field that the world would remember, not because anyone could point to exactly where it was, but because of what had been decided there. 5 armies had come to put an end to a nation. The nation had put an end to them instead. The banners moved south. The dead stayed where they lay. Over the field of Brunanburh, silence slowly returned, broken only by the wide circles of carrion birds overhead, and by the simple, undeniable fact of what had happened there, that England had walked into its furnace and walked back out.